Welcome, everybody, once again to our AIA CES approved course 9/11 An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, January 4th, 2018. Happy New Year. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 2,900 architects and engineers dedicated to educating building professionals and the public about the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story high-rise that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th. Let me first introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Richard. Hello, everyone. I just want to remind you, as I always do, that we will be taking questions related to the material that Richard presents today at the end of the webinar. You can submit those questions by entering them in the questions and answer box at ae911truth.org. Also, sometimes YouTube defaults to low resolution. You can fix that by clicking the gear box beneath the video screen and selecting 720 HD resolution. That'll clear the pictures right up for you. So with that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Andy. And can you go on and tell everybody how they can get credit for the course today? We're using the second script that I had sent you.
Okay, well, that is very important. So architects and engineers can receive one learning unit for taking our course today. For those of you who are AIA members, as an approved course provider, we will be reporting your attendance directly to the AIA. So at this time and also at the end of our program today, we will need you to log your attendance by submitting your name, AIA number, and other information, including any questions you might have in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. If you're not an AIA member, we can email you a certificate of course completion, which you can forward to your other association for credit. Just got to ask us for it. Or if you're catching us later in the YouTube archive, you'll need to pass a simple short quiz to earn your learning unit. Please feel free to follow along with that quiz as we give the presentation here. You can find the quiz on our website at ae911truth.org/continuing-ed, or just look for the Continuing Ed banner on our homepage at ae911truth.org. And please see our several other AIA-approved course formats, including the opportunity to bring our live presentation to your firm or AIA chapter for the additional benefit of your colleagues. Now, with that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time with this 9/11 reinvestigation, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. And what we want to realize is that I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And this course is approved by the AIA, but of course they don't endorse anything that we or their other content providers do mention in our courses. You know, never before has a steel frame high-rise building collapsed from fire. Why then did the World Trade Center Building 7 collapse on 9/11? The collapse was attributed to normal office fires, yet it occurred in the manner of a typical controlled demolition. Today, together, we'll evaluate which of these two hypotheses, fire-induced failure or controlled demolition, is more consistent with the evidence. You'll be encouraged to decide for yourselves if a new investigation is warranted. After today's course, you'll be able to describe the characteristics of building fires and the aspects of design that have contributed to make fire-induced failure in steel frame buildings a rare occurrence. You'll be able to also recognize the distinct features associated with fire-induced failure versus those associated with controlled demolition, and describe step by step the series of structural failures that NIST claimed to be the cause of the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, and analyze the physical evidence and dynamics of this building's collapse according to how consistent they are with the hypothesis of fire-induced failure and controlled demolition. Did you know about World Trade Center Building 7? The American Institute of Architects has not its architects about the collapse of this 47-story skyscraper. And so most architects remain completely unaware of the third worst structural failure in modern history. This is true for structural engineers as well, because the American Society of Civil Engineers has about the same level of educating its professionals on this subject. And that's why we've taken it to task for ourselves to do this independently. This is a 47-story skyscraper, 600 feet tall, taller than most buildings in most of our states, and half the height of the Twin Towers, though, at the time they were built. They were the largest buildings in the world. Architect of record was Emery Roth and Sons. Structural engineer, Irwin Cantor. And so this building is a part of the World Trade Center complex. It is the 7th building in the series, built in the 1980s. Now, it wasn't hit by an airplane. It's the 3rd skyscraper to collapse on 9/11, about 100 yards north of the North Tower. And you can see it here as the North Tower has collapsed. It still remains standing. It did suffer some minor damage, which NIST mentioned was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. And so here it still stands until about 5:20, 7 hours later, it comes down. Well, let's take a look at that coming down here.
The second building collapsed. Came back 20 minutes later, looking like a Three Stooges movie covered with plastic. I swear to God. What are you going to go through that? That's the good shit. Then we went back there. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
So that was the 3rd worst structural failure that we've had of skyscrapers. And so we want to take a close look at that, and we will. Let's first listen to Shyam Sunder, the lead engineer in the investigation produced by NIST, the National Institute of Standards.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Primarily due to fires. Now, these are the fires that are said to have caused that, claimed to have caused that collapse. As you can see, they are few, small, and scattered. And these are the worst fires that we have photos or videos of. Now, we're going to look at these in some detail. At about 2:30, they are seen on the east side, where NIST has formulated its collapse initiation theory. About 3 o'clock, they're moving on to the west. And so NIST focuses in on this column 79 under the east penthouse, because the east penthouse, as you may have noticed, did collapse about 6 seconds earlier than the overall building. And so the focus is on fires in this area. And so NIST has created a fire simulation, which actually shows that these fires were burning up until the time of the collapse, as you can see at 5 o'clock. However, the problem is that and NIST acknowledges, first of all, that fires don't persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. And yet in their simulation, these fires burning over 2 hours in that area around that column. This is important because the fires, the photos and videos show that those fires moved on after about 3:50. Side on the 12th and 13th floor, the focus of their initiation of collapse, they had moved on to the west. And so a more likely simulation of these fires is shown by AE 911 Truth. About 3 o'clock, those fires are shown, 79, and then they move on to the west. And so the problem is that there's no fires burning here at the time for an hour before the collapse. So this is a problem because, as you'll see, NIST has a very specific theory as to how this building came down as a result of thermal expansion.
Identify thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So thermal expansion would require those fires to be burning at the time of the collapse because they're...
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining columns.
Because this thermal expansion pushed a beam off of its seat and creating this progressive failure that you just heard NIST talking about. So what are we saying? The official story says that these long span 50-foot beams heated up immediately prior to the collapse of this building at 5:20 by fires, which weren't even there. And by a process of heat, which couldn't have happened because these beams are fire protected. They have fireproofing on them halfway through that construction. Here you can see that that's the case. And yet they claim that these beams expanded, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column, allowing this floor to fail then after several floors fail, 9 of them, allowing this column to become unbraced, slender, therefore, and buckling, and allowing the complete vertical progression of collapse that you just saw in NIST's computer model. Several problems with this whole theory. The fires are burnt out 2 hours before. The beams are fire protected so that they wouldn't even sustain the kind of heat. There's only enough fire in this area for 20 or 30 minutes as admitted by NIST, and yet we have 2 and 3 hour fire protection here. They also apply all the heat from that fire into these beams in just a second and a half, forcing the material to expand longitudinally instead of sagging as it would do naturally, as you will see in what happens in normal steel frame buildings in fires. Well, even if all that could have happened and pushed this, it couldn't have pushed this girder off of its seat because that girder has shear studs. Are shown in the shop drawings. Here, NIST omits those shear studs, allowing that girder then to slide off. Well, let's just say that it didn't have shear studs and it could slide off. There's 2 other massive girders framed into this column, which would have held most of this floor intact. So even if this girder could have fallen, it would have fallen substantially by itself, producing maybe a dent in this concrete floor, but not the severing of the additional girder immediately below it that's framed into this column as well. And there wouldn't have been a progressive collapse, therefore. But let's just say that all that could have happened and that this girder fell off of its seat after it was pushed 6 inches. Actually, that couldn't have happened either. Why? Because is actually keeping that flange from folding because it is welded to both the web and the flange in the side view here, of this girder. So that girder would have had to have been pushed all the way off of its seat, at least 11 inches, which there's not enough thermal expansion capability or coefficient in these beams to produce such a failure. So NIST omits these stiffeners from their analysis and says, yes, it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat. Well, even if that could have happened, we wouldn't have had the and even if there was a progressive collapse vertically through this entire structure, we would not we would have seen the results of that in the video, which you just saw and that you will see again. What you won't see is the buckling and crippling and warping of the exterior perimeter structural steel system, which would have happened if there was an interior collapse here. It would have looked like a beer can crumpling with massive breaking up of the granite panels on the exterior and incredible quantities of windows breaking, none of which do we see. And NIST then suggests that this vertical collapse from the 12th floor all the way up to the top floor then travels laterally in about 15 seconds across the width of this building, which is football field long building, the length of this building. So that is an extraordinary level of destruction that would require 400 structural steel connections failing every second throughout this building. And that just can't happen. Let's take a look at NIST and their computer animation.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with a video of the event.
Well, we'll see about that in a minute. In fact, right now, the computer model is on the right. The video event is on the left. We don't see a massive buckling of the building whatsoever. The computer model itself begins to tip over, which any natural collapse would do, tipping to the path of least resistance, the injured side, in this case to the right, and they stop it after 2 seconds. Why do they stop it after 2 seconds? Because it begins to look nothing like the video. In fact, they had 7 years to run this video. It's computer animation, and it completely undermines their own hypothesis. So we have some real problems here. And so we've submitted a FOIA request. Release the computer input data. So we, the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety, can have this to make these buildings not a problem. Because if this building came down by office fires, and we have hundreds of buildings that are somewhat similarly designed that need correction, and future buildings that need to be designed differently, yet it was denied. The reason? It might jeopardize public safety. Wait a minute. It's for the public safety that we have to release this information. So we have a real problem. And that's why we use the scientific method. We've had it for 100 years in the West or so. If we formulate a question on what caused the building to collapse, that's fairly simple, straightforward. We do some background research, make observations, construct a hypothesis, make predictions based on those hypotheses. Did fire bring the building down? That's our best guess. Fire. No, maybe controlled demolition. All the rational hypotheses are laid out, and we don't focus in on one due to financial or political considerations that might jeopardize our scientific objective opinion. So we test those with experiments, all the hypotheses. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. I saw an example of NIST doing, which was to deny the most basic computer input data to those of us who must have that. The hypothesis is not corroborated. We go back, construct new hypotheses until they stand up against the experiments, the data, the background research, etc. So with this in mind, let's do some background research, apply the scientific method, find out, well, what are the forces that have destroyed buildings? Fire is certainly a destructive force. It's an organic process. It moves through an area, as we mentioned, every 20 minutes or so, burning out that area and moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building does collapse due to fire, and as you'll see, never in history have we had a skyscraper collapse solely due to fire. But in wood frame buildings, for instance, the building would burn out in an area. It would fall asymmetrically or fall over in stages. It wouldn't collapse straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the cold, hard, intact structure immediately below. What about steel frame buildings? Well, here is the massive test done in 1995 in the UK with 2,000-degree fires in a building that they built 8 stories tall just for the purpose of burning it down to see what would happen. They have fireproofed and unfireproofed steel framing in here.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, we're referring here to 9/11, when we had not one, not two, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. And in this case, unprotected sections of the building did not fail either. This is particularly relevant to Building 7, where we had a protected steel structure that failed. And yet here in this test, even unprotected steel structures, as you see, did not fail due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. It's very stable, is one of the main conclusions there. Not even in Los Angeles, where we have 3.5 hours burning over 5 floors. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. No failure in these buildings. The buildings are remodeled, put back into use. Even in China, with 2009, with a complete conflagration from top to bottom. Do we have failure? No. Before on the left, after on the right, slightly toasted around the edges, put back into use as well. And here in this 1-story building where we had a fire, unprotected steel also did not fail. So there's quite a precedent for the viability, duration, and robustness of steel structures. Now, there have been mid-rise structures that have failed due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The building will tip over toward the path of least resistance. Its concrete structure, in this case concrete, is not pulverized to a fine powder. And we see a building that's recognizable as such. At the base, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. This is an important piece of our background research, as is buildings which exploded. We have thick billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete, which is expanding rapidly due to the incredible heat from the explosives in these cauliflower-shaped plumes that are expanding with suspended pulverized building materials in them, forming a thickly defined edge to this. This is very characteristic of explosions. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Explosions can be harnessed quite efficiently in buildings when we want to bring them down. As you see here, we place thousands of cutter charges in a very meticulously engineered process where explosive loaders place the explosives against the columns and beams in the building and set them off precisely timed floor by floor. There's only a handful of companies that can accomplish this, and fire never has. So this is pretty important. There's a set of features associated with controlled demolitions. There's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. A straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint because there's a patterned removal of column supports, resulting in a free fall acceleration, often, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, and the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. Feature number 6, the limited damage to adjacent structures. That's the goal, one of them. Patterned explosions heard and seen by witnesses, flashes of light seen by witnesses too, sometimes. Broken up concrete, the floors ready for loading and shipment, and explosive charges visible at many of these floors. These are called squibs, or isolated explosive ejections. Chemical evidence left behind in the debris, of course, explosive devices or residues. Direct evidence of destruction is what all of these are. And fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. The fires collapse asymmetrically when they collapse buildings with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. So if we have additional circumstantial corroborative evidence like government documentation, and you have to get a permit to bring a building down like this, people know about it in advance. There's foreknowledge. Experts agree, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts who don't have financial or political obligations that would sway their. And video documentation all is proof of controlled demolition. So with that in mind, let's take a look at Building 7 and see if it has any of these characteristic features. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen to this one narrated by Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, that's very helpful information from Dan, using his intuition to figure out what's happening. We should all be doing that. We've seen the old hotels, for instance, in Las Vegas that look exactly like this. So maybe we should include it in our possibility of hypotheses. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Now this time, look at the penthouse, the main penthouse and screen wall, which cover the elevator core of this building, drop symmetrically, simultaneously, all at once, a half a second prior to the overall building coming down. But wait, weren't we just told by NIST that the initiation of collapse started on one side of the building, the east side, on the left of this building, and then travel across in about 10 or 15 seconds the football length of this building? Well, that would have shown us something very different. We wouldn't have the complete symmetrical drop of the core a half a second prior. So this completely undermines the NIST theory as well as the other points that we've been making here. And it does fall into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint. That's how symmetrical it did fall. That doesn't happen naturally. Let's take a look side by side. Building 7 on the left, a known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper in history. before 9/11, and so it should not have the hypothesis of controlled demolition been the first, if not the only rational hypothesis considered here. And yet it was relegated to an afterthought after thousands of people inquired of NIST, hey, this looks like a controlled demolition. Did you look at that? So a frequently asked question came out. No, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition. We'll take a look at that. So yet these fires, random, scattered, small, brought this building down symmetrically. How does that happen? Well, let's look at feature number 3. How do you bring a building straight down? You have to remove the core columns, 24 of them in this case, all together, and then all 80 columns, the perimeter, simultaneously within fractions of a second of each other. Does fire have that precision? Critical question for all of us building professionals and Americans to answer. Yet these fires brought it down symmetrically. How fast is the building coming down? Let's look at feature number 4 and listen to David Chandler, physics teacher.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Buildings don't have zero resistance, though, as we'll see. This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel holding it up. It was 3 to 5 times stronger than it ever needed to be to hold up that building. Yet it falls, gaining distance with every second. It fits the free fall curve perfectly. It's as if 8 stories were suddenly removed.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Indeed, NIST is forced in a public conference to admit that they weren't accurate, because previously they had denied that the building came down at free fall for any length of time. And yet here in their final report, they were forced to admit that the building came down in free fall for at least a third of its 7-second fall. But they suggest that this is consistent with their previous data, which is to completely obfuscate the point that how can a building fall at free fall? Well, all those columns have to be removed at once. And that results in feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the structural steel system. I mean, here's a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame skyscraper that collapses to 4 stories, like a house of cards, as if those, and therefore those connections, those moment-resisting connections must have given way. As we mentioned, 400 structural steel connections failing per second to bring this building down that fast. Buildings that fall naturally don't fall straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance. They tend to fall over, and resulting in limited damage to adjacent structures, as you see here in the adjacent post office and Verizon building, fairly limited damage. What about feature number 7? Are there witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Well, what does Shyam Sunder of NIST say?
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
No? Well, let's listen to a few witnesses.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and you know, it was horrifying. And then you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You know, we were in shock, and then the worst part.
The building collapsed after hearing explosions. Well, what about this gentleman, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, had gone up into the building, not realizing that it had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. Here's their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing. We made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs? Well, is there any other evidence of bombs? Let's listen to these firefighters. Late morning, 9/11, near Building 7.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Not many of these witnesses of explosions are included in the final report by NIST. Not one. This is pretty relevant information, especially given the appearance of these. How about the seismic study? There was a seismic wave associated with the time of the collapse, and so NIST quite conveniently suggests that the start of the collapse was noted at 5:20 p.m. and 52 seconds. But the seismic signal actually starts 12 seconds earlier than that. So NIST is left with an explanation, which they suggest this discrepancy is likely due to the falling of debris from inside of the collapse. Now, that's consistent with their theory that the collapse starts at least that many seconds earlier than the interior collapse, than the exterior collapse. But we have just disproven that theory 6 ways from Sunday. So this doesn't work. It's more likely, far more likely, that the seismic waves here are a result of explosions. In fact, that is the conclusion of Andre Rousseau, who says the bell-like form of this seismic wave points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion to the ground due to the falling of debris. The seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies, and these undeniably have an explosive origin. Wave velocities and frequencies are easily explained if you consider that the seismic waves were created by strong explosives. I encourage you to look at this paper produced in 2012, peer-reviewed paper. And then pyroclastic-like clouds. What does this mean? Is there incredible heat produced here? Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation says look for large volumes of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, which can cause rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Do we have such? Well, look, racing in every direction away from the collapse of Building 7 at 35 miles an hour, expanding several times the volume of the building in just seconds with these pyroclastic-like clouds that comes from the term associated with volcanoes, with incredible heat and suspended pulverized building solids. That is produced by what? The heat from these few small scattered fires? Can't happen. It's a lot more heat than that. Something on the order of what you see here. How about persistent heat and the cause of this heat and other evidence of this heat? Well, the NASA air flights with their infrared sensitive cameras pick up 1,340 degree temperatures on the surface of Building 7's collapse. Well, these are temperatures associated with the extremely hot fires. And yet, there's no fire on the surface. So what are we measuring here? We're measuring the radiant heat that is coming up from deep down in the pile, from something that surely must be much hotter than 1,340 degrees as it appears as it gets up to the surface. Let's look at some more evidence here from Jonathan Barnett, FEMA author. Says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. How do you evaporate steel? That takes 4,000 degrees. Where are we getting 4,000 degree temperatures from those few small scattered fires that we've seen? Can't happen. Let's listen to another structural engineer, Abolhassan Astani Azel, who had access through the National Science Foundation grant to the steel.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw melting of girders. Well, it takes 2,800 degrees to melt girders, steel girders, as you see here, as he documented from this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. It is melted. What melted it? Can office fires melt it? No, that's why they did a metallurgical examination in the FEMA May of 2002 Building Performance Assessment Report. So here's Appendix C, which documents never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, causing a solid steel girder to look like Swiss cheese, as you see here. What can cause this? Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. But there's no mention of this in the final report by NIST. Only in FEMA. NIST took over the investigation and took out all of this fascinating information. Liquid iron, sulfur, formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. But there's no mention of this in the NIST report. It's called perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation by the New York Times, and yet it is ignored by NIST. Well, NIST says we couldn't test the steel. We didn't have any steel. No steel from World Trade Center 7. The steel wasn't recovered. No steel was recovered. Steel not recovered. Steel precludes test particles. Tests on actual materials. No metallography could be carried out. Well, this isn't true because we just saw that FEMA, before NIST, had done detailed examination of the steel. In fact, here's the co-project leader of the NIST report himself, Jonathan Gross, cutting off the very piece of steel that was provided to FEMA to produce that metallurgical examination. So clearly steel was available. So somebody's not telling the truth here. How do we get those kind of temperatures that can do that to steel? Hydrocarbons, which is buildings, even jet fuel, only produces temperatures 600, maybe 1400 degrees typically. Yet steel had melted during the event. As you see here, we can tell what the temperature is of molten material by its color. We're exceeding 2500 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet fires are only half of the, not even half of these temperatures typically. Thomas Iger, who supports the official story, says the World Trade Center fires are about 1200 degrees. What caused the steel to melt? Is there forensic evidence of something that could cause the steel to melt? Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here. If thermite were used, it could explain the extreme hot temperatures, 4,000 degrees, the byproduct of thermite. It would explain the molten iron, elemental iron, not steel, but iron. We haven't used iron in skyscrapers for about 100 years. This is elemental iron. It could also explain the sulfur. Sulfur's added to thermite to become thermate, producing even much more ability to cut through steel. So what about the investigations? The NFPA 921 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations says you look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. Now, NIST claims we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, when they were really pressed on this, they write, we didn't test for the presence of explosive residues. You can't find what you're not looking for, but others looked for it, and it wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones is one of them, a nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, has sent a piece of the slag from this monument made of World Trade Center steel, and he finds, well, this is cut very jagged. This isn't how oxyacetylene torches work. This is how oxyacetylene torches that the ironworkers were using to cut steel at the site. So something else is going on with these other beams from this Manitoba, Canada peace project with residue of aluminum indicating incomplete chemical reaction of thermite. Most aluminum is turned into aluminum oxide, an ash. Well, his results from X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the slag residue find what? The ingredients of thermite: iron, aluminum with manganese, sulfur, oxygen, silica, carbon. So that's fascinating, but it gets even more interesting as the U.S. Geological Survey does their detailed toxicological analysis on all this World Trade Center dust called Particle Atlas of World Trade Center dust. And what do they find? Billions and billions of previously molten iron microspheres throughout all the World Trade Center dust. They don't know where they came from, but they document it very carefully. They find that up to 6% of these dust samples contain iron microspheres, previously molten iron microspheres. And This is 150 times the background level, 6%. This isn't just normal, iron pieces found. And there's, by extrapolation, we're talking about 10 tons of microspheres in all the World Trade Center dust altogether. There's so much of it that there's a signature component used to distinguish the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust, with all of these spheres in it. The R.J. Lee, another nationally known environmental consulting firm, finds that these are formed during the event, not before, not after, during the event. How would you, the iron particles on the left are from normal house dust, on the right from the World Trade Center dust. How would you get iron microspheres? Well, if you had thousands of thermite cutter charges going off in an explosive environment, you would have them aerosolized, because the byproduct of thermite is liquid molten iron, which would be aerosolized under the pressure, and it would form, like you see here in this controlled experiment, into spherical shapes. And just in a small experiment, thousands and thousands of them, about the diameter of a human hair, readily seeable. Due to the surface tension, it forms aerosolized liquid into spheres, which is what raindrops really are. Well, could that be responsible for the toasting of the tops of all of these cars throughout the World Trade Center area, next to the these tall buildings that came down? Is there any other rational explanation of this extreme heat toasting the tops of these cars? Well, you can make actual thermite cutter charges in your backyard, like John Cole did, and shaped cutter charges. As you can see, they cut very cleanly through the steel. In fact, here's an example experiment. And they do cut cleanly through the steel if properly designed. And there are much more efficiently designed inventions, in this case thermite-based apparatus, which is a shaped cutter charge issuing in hundreds of milliseconds molten iron streams through much thicker structural steel more efficiently than C4 and RDX, which are normally used high energy explosives in controlled demolitions. Why wouldn't they have to have used those? Well, they produce very high audio and visual signatures, flashes, bangs. So in the deceptive controlled demolition, one wouldn't want that. In fact, one might even use consolidated thermite in the casing of these cutter charges, which burns up the whole casing altogether, leaving nothing but molten iron in the residue, which there is a whole lot of. And what else was found, though, in the World Trade Center dust? Because a team of scientists led by Niels Harrit and Stephen Jones received 7 independently collected samples, and 4 of them were collected and analyzed. And this material is red on one side, gray on the other, kind of looks like paint, and they're dual layered, but they come up to a magnet. So they get real curious and zoom into the red layer and do an X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and find what? The ingredients of thermite in the red layer, aluminum and iron, along with oxygen, silica, carbon. This is the residue of thermite. They get real curious now, zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope and find what? Rhomboidal crystalline particles of iron oxide and aluminum platelets mixed in an organic material of oxygen, silica, carbon. So these particles are 1,000 times smaller than the human hair at the nano scale. is a very sophisticated material. And in an organic material bed, you have an incendiary that appears to be engineered to become more explosive because organic material is used in TNT. It provides the expansion or the concussive force associated with dynamite or high energy explosives. So here you have something very unique. And when they are heated up in a differential scanning calorimeter at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit, they ignite, producing what? Spheres. Spheres, molten iron spheres with the same chemical signature as those produced in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where these spheres came from, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So this is a set of experimentally repeatable data that's internally consistent, self-corroborating, that needs to be brought into the light of day in a court case by criminal investigators to find out who was responsible for this. I mean, this material is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. It's very sophisticated because then when you nano engineer these materials, the surface volume, because of the extremely small size of the particles, the surface volume increases exponentially and you get instantaneous chemical reactions. So it becomes more explosive. It's made only in extremely sophisticated labs. And so we've got a source for an investigation. Investigators of this material conclude the red layer is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic polytechnic or explosive material. This is produced as a peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It has not been contested in the peer-reviewed sense. It stands uncontested. A way to challenge somebody's produce peer-reviewed papers of your own. And while they'll stand up and say, hey, this is just paint. No, paint doesn't have these exotic properties. So this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire doesn't create these features. As you know, fire caused less robust structures to collapse, but it does so asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. Why is that, by the way, that fires don't have this capability to bring buildings down? Well, steel is very dense. It conducts heat away from the source of the fire throughout the multi-ton system. So it never gets to its critical 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature where steel can lose half of its strength and then sag. Cementitious fireproofing also keeps that heat from ever becoming a problem in fire protected buildings where we have 2 and 3 hour fire protections on the beams and columns. We also build these buildings out of non-combustible materials and highly regulate the content that tenants can bring in to modern office buildings. So we don't have a problem. And if we ever have a trash can fire, they typically go out with fire sprinklers, which of course were compromised by the airplanes in the case of the Twin Towers. And in case of Building 7, the Twin Towers collapse caused water mains, it's said, to have been compromised. Well, at Building 5, we certainly had a fully engulfed building. And if any of the buildings in the World Trade Center were to collapse due to fire, we'd expect it to be this one. Did it? No. Mid-rise office, high-rise office buildings do not collapse. Fire. Not even by these relatively small, randomly placed. Couldn't have been. It's said to have brought this building down in 6.5 seconds. Yeah. The first time ever. What about additional circumstantial corroborative testimony? Data from the FEMA and NIST reports. We did have an investigation. FEMA came out, $600,000 worth of funding. Finally, they using the same volunteers that they started with, who were complaining about access to the blueprints, access to the steel, bureaucratic restrictions, the FEMA refusing to let them appeal to the public for photographs and videos. They had a heck of a time. In 2008, NIST took over the investigation throughout the Appendix C metallurgical examination, even though they had $20 million. Well, not in the case of Building 7, but I have 1,000 pages of obfuscation, and yet they still suggest that truthfully we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Great. But FEMA came out and suggested further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue. And yet they couldn't, because there appears to have been a destruction of evidence. And what was that? The largest and most perplexing structures in history, but the steel had been taken away from Building 7 starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. 400 truckloads a day put on barges and shipped to China for recycling before the forensic engineers could get their hands on it and do a proper investigation. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Citing Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. Oh, what did the experts say? At least those experts who have less influenced by political and financial considerations, such as the handful of controlled demolition companies in this country who rely on federal contracts, which might keep them from disagreeing formally on such a massive issue as this with their signers of their paychecks. But how about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolition expert from Europe?
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Okay, how about Hugo Bachmann, chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, says, in my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was, with great probability, professionally demolished. And Kamal Obeid, one of 100 structural engineers questioning the official story. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Is there foreknowledge of the destruction of this building? Well, let's take a look here. We have an anonymous engineer predicting this collapse because Chief Hayden, Fire Chief Hayden, asked him, we allowed it to burn. Could we anticipate a collapse? How soon? Turned out he was pretty much right on the money. He said you have about 5 hours. So here we have an anonymous engineer predicting the unprecedented collapse of a skyscraper by fire within minutes. That is really good. This prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. Yet Chief Hayden will not release the name of said engineer. Very problematic. How about these construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
About to blow up, flame and debris coming down. How do they know that a building that has a few small random scattered fires is about to blow up? And Kevin McPadden, what did he say prior to his witnessing of the explosions? He and others were held back several blocks away from Building 7 because they're anticipating a collapse. They're told it had structural damage. And he is listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
2 fires bring buildings down to countdowns? About the BBC, who announced this collapse of this building, the unprecedented collapse of this building, 20 minutes before it even happened.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. So how lucky can they be to announce the collapse of this building before it even happens? Are they psychic? They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. CNN actually announced the collapse of the building that morning after the Twin Towers had collapsed. Take a look.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a fire.
50 stories went down? There's no other building that went down as a result of the Twin Towers going down, much less a 50-story building. Had it gone down at that time, it would have been completely obscured in the massive dust cloud created when the Twin Towers went down 15 minutes earlier. We would never have these videos of it. Was it supposed to go down? We don't know. But it could explain why these construction workers are walking away from Building 7, telling us it's about to blow up. Might also explain these words by Larry Silverstein a year after 9/11. He had acquired the whole World Trade Center complex, having previously owned Building 7 that he built in the 80s, mid-80s. He acquired the rest of the buildings just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. He's interviewed here on PBS's America Rebuilds.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
They made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Well, FEMA reports that the firefighters made the decision early on not to attempt the fires, to fight the fires, due in part to the damage from the towers. So no manual firefighting operations were taken by FDNY, according to FEMA. Sham Sunder of NIST says there was no firefighting at all in World Trade Center Building 7. So there's no firefighters to pull, because Larry Silverstein came back and said, oh, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, they weren't in the building. By 11:30 a.m., Chief Fellini ordered the firefighters away. So we got some problems. Have we shown a hypothesis that is corroborated for controlled demolition? Do we have 10 key characteristic and uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition? Can fire create any one of these evidence of destruction with explosives? Is there additional circumstantial corroborative evidence supporting the hypothesis of controlled demolition? Is that proof to you of controlled demolition? If so, I encourage you to look further into this issue, and we want to close the official educational portion of this course at this point and begin to take your questions. First, I want to encourage, I want to ask Andy to let us know how the architects and engineers can get credit for today's course. Andy?
Okay, at this time, be sure to submit your name, AIA number if you have one, your email, city and state on the questions and information form. If you're not an AIA member, just ask us for a certificate of course completion, which you can then submit to your other association for credit. Also, you can submit your questions now in the same input form, and we will do our best to answer them. Or if you're watching the on-demand course on the YouTube archive, you can now start your online quiz. Also, be sure to sign up for our monthly email newsletter on the right side of the website. In the meantime, we're going to take just a few minutes to answer some questions and tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investment.
And thanks so much, Andy. We have the quiz you'll find right here, as Andy mentioned. Please sign up for our email newsletter online at our website here so that you can follow the important work that we are about and get informed as well on the website. Sign the petition calling for a new investigation. Join 2,900 other architects and engineers and 20,000 additional people by signing this petition calling upon Congress for a new investigation of the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. You can sign that petition here for us. Do donate and become a member of AE 9/11 Truth, as 2,000 others are supporting us on a monthly basis, trying to keep the educational effort and waking up of the American people in general, specifically government officials, media officials, academic institutions, and professionals in the building industry. Volunteer and help us. In fact, Andy, what are some of the volunteer opportunities?
Oh, we have a lot of them, especially coming up in the new year. As Richard mentioned, we have the Bobby McIlvaine Act that we're trying to get passed through Congress, and that's going to require a lot of help from our supporters, from people that want to volunteer. Plus, there's other duties that you can do too. So, if you've got just a few hours a week that you can give to this important cause, we ask you to give them. You can join our volunteer team by going to ae911truth.org, selecting the What You Can Do tab at the top, and then there's an option to volunteer. You fill out a very short application, and we'll get in touch with you and get you to work.
Pretty awesome. Thanks so much, Andy. You can do that right here on the website at ae911truth.org. You can also, on your own, reach out to elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers, based on the information you find on our website. Tell everybody you know. Screen the documentaries that we have, the DVDs. Share the brochures one-on-one. In fact, there's an excellent 3-year, $300,000 finite element analysis that we've contracted the University of Alaska, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, the chairman of the Civil Engineering Department, Professor Leroy Hulsey, to do the study, the computer study that NIST was tasked by Congress with doing, but who failed miserably, as you have seen. And this will be quite different. We're expecting the results shortly in February. The draft report, we need your feedback on that and need you to support this study financially as well. Now, more about that can be read in our Beyond Misinformation booklet, which is, you can also get 2 hours of HSW learning units by reading this 50-page booklet. It's a critique of NIST, all 3 skyscrapers, and their official the official version of events as they claim. So we have also a landmark documentary with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. I want to give you just a 3-minute peek before you get to your questions here.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And earn 1 HSW learning unit from the AIA for watching that DVD right on our website. We also have a 15-minute documentary in World Trade Center 7 narrated by actor Ed Asner, which is extraordinary and will convince anyone about the controlled demolition of Building 7. And many, many other courses, of course, including the opportunity to bring the course live to your AIA chapter or to your firm. Andy, I think we might have some questions at this point.
Right. We have one question today, and it asks, did Chief Hayden give the name of the anonymous engineer who predicted WTC-7's collapse to NIST?
He never did. And this is extraordinary. He's been asked again and again. And that's why he remains anonymous. So, here's an engineer who predicts the completely unprecedented collapse of a skyscraper that has a few small scattered fires in it, and yet, man, he predicted it 5 hours earlier, and he was within minutes of it coming down. I mean, how ludicrous is that? Do you have anything to add to that? I can't even wrap my brain around that one, Andy.
Well, what baffles me more is I heard an interview with Shyam Sundar that an activist conducted with him right after the Building 7 report came out, and he didn't really seem to show much interest in knowing who this engineer was. So, it seems that if there's any controversy over what brought this building down, and you have somebody on the ground who's predicting that it's going to come down, that this person would be featured more prominently, and that they would point to him and say, this is the guy, and here is why he said this. But we've not heard much other than being an anonymous engineer, and the whole issue has been sort of dropped at that. We certainly would like to talk to him. So if this anonymous engineer is watching, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, there's stories also of a bulging of a part of the facade of the building. Now, if that were true and the building was weakened by any structural damage due to the Twin Towers falling earlier, which NIST, by the way, says is insignificant. So the official story says it's insignificant damage. It was not a significant factor in the building's collapse, which happened on the backside, the northeast side of the building. And so if there was damage on the front side, meaning the south or so, southwest, then the building would have fallen over toward its damaged area. That's intuitive. If you get kicked in the knee, you fall in that direction, not toward the strong side, which is why NIST was ultimately forced to declare that the damage to the building was not a significant factor. And so there's a lot of conflicting stories. You heard also in the course today, NIST came back and acknowledged that diesel fuel fires were not a factor in this building's collapse. They had originally come out and declared that that was their main hypothesis, because this building did have generators and diesel generators on the 5th floor and diesel tanks. And so, but there was no diesel fuel fires, and that was, NIST had to reverse their theory on that, because one of our members did a detailed report showing that the 5th floor, which has ventilators, louvers all around it, had no smoke coming out of those ventilators. So there was no diesel fuel burning, fortunately. So NIST had to rely on this cockamamie theory that is so full of holes. So we rely not on the ridiculousness of the theories, which we have pointed so many errors and examples of unethical behavior on their part, but we actually rely solely conclusion of the corroboration of the hypothesis of controlled demolition on the evidence for controlled demolition, not on the evidence for a weak theory on the part of NIST. The evidence we've talked about is extreme heat, incendiaries, explosions heard by witnesses, the free fall of a 47-story building collapsing in just 7 seconds, exactly like a controlled demolition, and on and on and on. And any other final thoughts come to you before we close?
No, I think you covered it. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and we'll be doing it again next week.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. Do remember that you can have us come to your chapter and give a live virtual presentation. And we'll be happy to do that. Everybody can get AIA credits for that, HSW learning units. Sign up for our email bulletins and pass the link for this course around so everybody can benefit from the knowledge that you just did. We'll be back with part 2 next week. And that's on Thursday, a week from today, at 2 p.m. Pacific for the World Trade Center buildings, and that's the Twin Towers explosive destruction that we'll start with, and next week, and where we look at the sudden near freefall collapse of these buildings, the high velocity lateral ejections, shattering in the steel frame, midair pulverization of concrete. The new section that we've developed on the seismic evidence, which shows evidence of explosions, not a collapse. And also the part 3, a week after that, we'll be looking at the evidence of extreme heat, where we go into a whole lot more detail than we were able to today about the pyroclastic light clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite and nanothermite. So do join us. Until then, I hope you have a great week, everybody. Bye for now.